Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Diverse Ed World Book Day event. We have hosted this event for the last 4 years as a way to celebrate all of the authors from our network. I'm a former English teacher. I love reading, and I think it's really important for us to be celebrating the brilliant authors and writers in our network to make sure you know who they are, what they're writing, to get their books on your library shelves for your pupils and for your staff as well. So in panel one, we are going to be exploring the loose theme, the umbrella theme of diversity in schools. And I'm joined by the authors and co-authors of 4 texts. We have Adam and Joe from Pride and Progress. We're going to talk about co-writing, co-editing a book. We have Naomi here, who is one half of the Evans sisters, and she's going to talk about the book that she wrote with her sister. We have Orleen here, and we have Rachel here. So 4 brilliant books for you to find out all about. The panel format's going to be each author, authors are going to have 5 minutes to talk to you about their book. So please put comments and questions in the chat, because there'll be a Q&A after each panel. So Adam and Joe, over to you, tag team extraordinaire from Pride and Progress. Tell us all about the book that I know has won lots of awards since you published it as well.
Thank you so much, Hannah. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. I'm Joe, half of Pride and Progress, and my colleague Adam, I'm sure we'll talk in a moment. Pride and Progress, if you don't know, is a podcast and a community group that amplifies the voices of LGBT plus educators. And we began our life as a podcast, having conversations about how we can make schools more inclusive. And afterwards, we'd been running the podcast and the platform for a number of years when a publisher reached out to us and asked if we'd be interested to develop that podcast, that work, into a book. Adam, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about how we went about that.
Yeah, so it was a great adventure. We had 6 months to write the book, so it was a very, very busy time. And when the publisher approached us, they'd already published some books for other podcasts, so they sent us some copies of those books and said, "Oh, would you like to publish something like this?" And the books had been sent. They were great, but they were predominantly sort of transcripts of podcasts with some thoughts. And while they're great books, we wanted to write something a little bit different. So we wanted to really amplify the voices from our Pride and Progress network, because we thought that was so important, those authentic lived experiences. But we also wanted to combine what we thought were our skills from the podcast. So what we decided to do was look at all the podcast episodes and come up with what we thought were 10 key themes, 10 keys to unlocking this idea of an LGBT plus inclusive space within our schools. So we picked 10 topics for our chapters, and then each chapter we separated into 3 sections. So I might let Joe talk a little bit about how we sort of divided up each chapter.
Yeah, that's right. Adam and I kind of take these natural roles in the podcast where Adam is the intelligent one, perhaps the academic, the one that is well aware of all the research and the theory that underpins the work that we do. And I think I'm just a nice storyteller. And we kind of translated those roles into the book as well. So each chapter is split up to in theory, in practice, and in action. So we talk about what that concept looks like in theory, looking at the research and the theory that underpins that. Adam writes that part of the chapter. I then talk about what that looks like in practice, applying that theory and that research into our schools, into our classrooms. And that's we weave that together using the voices and the lived experiences of all of the guests on our podcast. So you get to hear from a number of LGBT plus educators about their experiences. And then afterwards, at the end of each chapter, there's an in-action section, which has a number of questions that you can then take into your schools and trying to put that theory and that practice into action in your classrooms.
Yeah, and it's been, it was released last year during Pride Month, which was a very nice time to launch the book. And like you said a moment ago, Hannah, we've had some amazing responses to the book. We've been really blown away by the response from people, which has been really lovely. And I think the crucial things for us was, first of all, it's quite a small book. As you can see, it's in like 140 pages. So we know that teachers are busy. We know that they haven't always got that amount of time. So the chapters are very, very short. They're sort of very rich in that research. And I think that's important because we know what it's like sometimes. You go into school, you have a conversation with an SLT member, and perhaps they don't see the significance or the importance of the work you're trying to do. So I think each part of that chapter gives that little bit of quote unquote credibility. But I think the voices then give that importance of empathy and understanding. And that really is the key to this work, as we all know. And I think that's the great response we've had from people that have read this book, how they've combined those two things, and then taken those questions at the end of each chapter to really sort of have really practical, implementable things they can do within their practice. And it's been so lovely to hear some of the responses we've got from that, isn't it, Joe?
Yeah, the final thing I would say is that Adam is a secondary school teacher and now academic working at university. I'm a primary school teacher, and the voices are really varied. So we hope that it's a book that is useful to all educators, whether they are early years, primary, secondary, higher or further education. And the goal really was to set out to try and create a handbook that educators can use to meaningfully make their schools more inclusive for LGBT plus people.
I'm not sure how full time we possibly have. Yeah.
But well, I was going to say very succinct. Thank you both of you for doing the work together, because we'll talk about that more probably in the Q&A about how you found that partnership. But for the brilliant work you've both done, and I think it's interesting to think about this idea of the podcast through to the book as well, and like the kind of the voice in those two spaces. So we'll move on. We'll definitely come back to some of that in the Q&A. So let me welcome Naomi, who's going to move us from thinking about LGBTQI inclusion in schools to anti-racism in schools and in wider society. So welcome, Naomi, and over to you.
Thank you, Hannah. Hi, everyone. It's lovely to be here this evening. Hannah said my name's Naomi, and I'm one half of an organisation called Everyday Racism, which I run with my sister, who unfortunately can't be here with us this evening, but she's entrusted me to talk about the book. So here's a copy of our book. It's actually our second book, but our first book for young people. So it's called Everyday Action and Everyday Change. Stay positive and motivated in the fight against racism and prejudice. And really the sort of journey of writing the book came in I guess a similar way to Joe and Adam, in the sense that we were putting content out on our Instagram page and were approached by publishers about developing that content. And the thing that I'm a teacher as well. I still work as a secondary school teacher, and I've got 2 children who are primary school age. And I think one of the things that I often observe is that there are people that really want to put these things into practice, but often they're like, where do I start? Like, what resource do I use? And for me, I was thinking about my 10-year-old son and how much he loves to sort of discuss these issues and things. And I was like, actually, I'd really love to write a book that he would be able to access and read independently, but equally it would be really helpful for his teachers as well, particularly, people that don't experience racism. It's a way for them to really kind of get that kind of foundational learning. And so I think the book kind of does 2 things really, but within that, we wanted to make the book as intersectional as possible. So we have included other types of discrimination and prejudice. And the book kind of just takes you on a journey of the different ways that people are marginalized and how we can be good friends, good allies to those people in our lives. And it takes the format of different chapters explaining those things. So we look at ableism, we look at racism, we look at homophobia and transphobia. And we've also brought in voices of our friends. So we were really lucky that we got to work with some other brilliant educators out there who obviously we can't speak to everybody's experiences. So we brought in some other people who have written about their experiences. And then at the end of each chapter are actions for young people to take. So there's sort of like a workbook element to it as well. And for me, that was really important because, as it's already been said, teachers were very busy and we wanted to make resources that could be very practical. So it's like you can buy the book, the students can read the book, you can photocopy elements of the book, and also there's a PDF so that there are free downloadable resources. So it literally can be a scheme of work sort of ready to go. I think what has been so lovely in terms of feedback is hearing parents that have bought it for their children, but then they said they've sat and read it themselves and learnt so much. So I love the way there's sort of been twofold things happening, and then people have been able to discuss it with their children, and that's been a really beautiful thing to see play out. And also just when people send you pictures of their kids reading the book, like they're just in bed and then there's a picture of them like wrapped up in bed taking it all in, and that's just such a lovely thing. So yeah, it's been a really beautiful experience. I spoke at a school this morning about the book, 600 students, and you're just like, yeah, this is why we do it. So yeah, I've had an amazing experience. So yeah, if you want to get the book, that'd be amazing, and you can download the free resources as well.
Fabulous, thank you. And I love all those multiple hats you're wearing there, and speaking to all those different bits of who we are as educators and humans. And we get it a lot, actually, parents and carers looking for advice and signposting. So the fact that they can all get something from that book, fabulous. Thank you so much, Naomi. I'm going to ping over to Orleen, who I've seen all over my LinkedIn doing her book work in the last few months, back in my patch of South London. So it's great to have you here, Orleen. Please tell us more about your book and the work you've been doing.
Thanks, Hannah. Thanks to all the other authors as well. It's still a bit of an unreal moment for me on World Book Day to be talking about my book. So, and it's good to be in such good company as well. I would say I have worked in education for 20 plus years. I'm giving away my age a little bit, and I was a head teacher for 7 of those years. And have done a lot of work kind of local authority wise. So how I managed to get the book published, because actually it's really hard to teach and publish a book. It's really hard to teach and write a book. So I have major props to everyone on here that's managed to do that. But I led the work of decolonising the curriculum for the Hackney syllabus that came out in 2020 to support schools in understanding how to diversify their curriculum. And then I was really lucky to be spotlighted in a Guardian article about that work, and then a publisher contacted me as a result of that article. So that was how I considered writing a book. I never thought I'd have the time. It was always something that I thought I would love to do but would never be able to do. And yeah, I had quite a strict regime to be able to do it, which I'd love to talk about if I had more time. But I think my book was really about I do a lot of training now. I do a lot of work with schools, and actually over the course of the last 4 years, I've been working with teachers who have said to me, what does racism look like in my classroom? Like, I understand, we all understand what kind of conscious hatred or conscious dislike looks like. We all recognise that and see that. We all recognise racial slurs. We recognise kind of any themes that sort of lean towards kind of far right movements, but actually the hidden embedded forms of racism, teachers were saying, actually, we don't know what that looks like in the classroom, and also we don't know how we're contributing to it because we don't know what it looks like. And so a lot of my work was about actually, how do I create a book that teaches us to see the bits of racism we've been taught not to see? So all those embedded forms such as microaggressions, tone policing, isolation, ostracization, lower expectations, perceptions of family and narratives. That was really important as part of this book, to ensure that teachers could understand the ways that they may be disrupting racism or maybe upholding it, and not always aware of the fact that they're doing that. So it was really important for me that this book empowered teachers to dismantle inequalities for our most systemically disadvantaged children. And how do we make it visible? That was the main purpose of the book. How do we make it visible? So we're no longer saying we don't believe racism exists in our classroom, but there were a lot of staff that were saying to me, we know that it exists, but we don't always see how it presents in the classroom. And I think also being in education, which is a bit of a vocation, I think people find it very difficult to accept that we may be upholding racism because we're here for every child. We want the best for every child. So actually seeing the ways that we consciously and subconsciously uphold that were really important. And I would say as everyone has said, so I think everyone who's come out of school understands the importance of a practical book that staff can pick up and run with and utilise straight away. So it was really important for me that there were case studies in there of schools that I've worked with who are doing the work of disrupting racism, who are seeing it in the classroom and recognising how to dismantle it. Because actually, one thing that we're really bad at in education is highlighting where it's working well. So it was really important to have the case studies there as an example of approaches that had been tried and tested. There are opportunities for reflection in there. There are resources that you can use and go to kind of further support that work. I'm going to try really hard to stay in the time now. And there's also ways of planning for action. So how do I plan for action? And actually, what does action look like? What can I do irrespective of the school that I'm in or the commitment from my senior leadership team? What can I do today? What can I do in the next 6 months? And I think ultimately the purpose of the book was, how do we create anti-racist leaders of the future? So it's not about how do we have a book that helps diverse communities in diverse schools. It was about how do we have a book, because actually the less diverse a school is, actually the more important this book is. So I really hope that I think I have had feedback that it is being utilised, it is practical, it is helping, and hopefully more of the same.
So I can see the name of your books on your T-shirt. Do you have a copy of the book to pop up and hold up to the camera? So the Anti-Racist Classroom. Show us the book jacket. There we go. Just so when you see it in the bookshops, you know what it looks like. So thank you, Orleen. We'll come back to some of the things you've mentioned there. Finally, Rachel, tell us all about the book that you published and birthed to the world last year.
Thanks, Hannah, and thanks for the invitation to be here. I feel very humbled to be in such an impressive company. And there are some obvious resonances and overlaps between my book and Orleen's and Naomi's. My book's called Unity in Diversity: How to Achieve Structural Race Equity in Schools. And I thought I'd just say a little bit about how I came to write it. So like Orleen, I was a head teacher. I was a head teacher for 16 years, firstly of 2 secondary schools, and then for my last 7 years in headship of an all-through school, 4 to 18-year-olds, came late to primary, had an epiphany. And then in 2018, I came out of headship to head up a school improvement organisation's education team of 100 advisors working in school settings, mainstream, special, right across the country, but based in Hertfordshire. And that was quite an eye-opener to me, because I'd always worked in very diverse schools in London. And suddenly I was supporting leaders of schools that might be predominantly or even exclusively white in terms of their pupil population and their staff boards and their governing boards. Coinciding with leaving headship, I was given a copy of Reni Eddo-Lodge's Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. And I read it, and it really was a jolt to me, because I thought I was quite racially literate. I'd always taken pride in ensuring a totally inclusive and equitable school for my diverse student and staff populations. But I realised that I'd got so much to learn, and that I was still on the base slopes, and that actually what I'd been guilty of doing sometimes as a leader was creating equality, not equity. And then, of course, closely following my beginning to read and starting to diversify my reading. And before I knew it, I got bookshelf after bookshelf sort of full of books around race equity, and I was becoming more racially literate. We saw the murder of George Floyd played out on our TV screens as we all sort of sat in lockdown. And my organisation, HFL Education, took a long, hard look at itself and decided that it was going to pledge to do much better by its racially minoritized staff, and to diversify its workforce more, and to do more in the work that we were doing with schools up and down the country around race equity. So I set a programme up, which has now just come to the end of its 3rd year, where school leaders can opt to come onto a programme for a year, meet together for 6 taught days over the course of the year, be lectured and spoken to by some great sort of national keynote speakers, leaders in this field, do school-to-school visits so they can see the work they're doing around race equity. And these are primary schools, secondary schools, mainstream, special, so really sort of diverse, from tiny sort of village nurseries right through to big sort of urban secondary schools. And they also, interestingly and importantly, pledge over the year to write a case study of their learning over the year, and how they're implementing their learning in their schools, and what goes well, and the challenges and setbacks they have. So very quickly, I was getting these amazing sort of case studies that I wanted a way of augmenting and spotlighting. also getting amazing testimony from people of colour who are leaders in schools and settings and trusts. And I decided that I wanted to put them together into a book which pulled together my learning over those years and the experiences of people, leaders that I've been working with. I had that challenge, and I had to talk to myself about whether I had any right or authority as a white, advantaged, privileged woman to write a book on this topic, and to potentially take a book contract away from a person of colour who might have a hell of a lot more right to write. And I asked friends of colour about whether they felt I should do it, and they said, as long as you amplify the voices of people of colour through the book and tell those stories, we think that's okay. And I was finally persuaded by Professor Paul Miller, who I'll never forget, sort of sat me down and said to me, it's not fair that you have privilege and other people don't. It's not fair that you're perhaps more likely to get a book writing contract than other people. But at the end of the day, that's not your fault. And you really have a choice to do nothing with all the learning, or to do something that's, putting yourself in the space of being a white ally. So I did. The book is divided into three sections after a sort of introduction that really lays out the problem and the issues and shows the racial inequity that we've got in our system structurally and in our education provision. It has a section around how to talk to young people of all ages about race and how to grow the racial literacy of your staff, with lots of case studies and examples. Then it has a section around diversifying and decolonising the curriculum, with, again, lots of examples and case studies from primary and secondary schools about how they've gone about it, and some of the sort of wonky bits and things that have gone wrong, as well as some of the success stories. But then perhaps where it's slightly different from Orlean's book, it has a third section, which is about recruiting, developing and retaining staff, governors, trustees of colour. And again, lots of sort of practical top tips about how to do that, because, as I say, a lot of the schools I'm working with are really struggling in that area. Like, I think practically all the books we've heard about so far this evening, it has the voices of people with lived experience. It has a lot of case studies and practical examples, and each chapter ends with activities that you could do in staff training, in a staff meeting, audit tools, reflections for leaders, reflections for teachers, reflections for governors and trustees. So it's designed to be a practical tool for school leaders, trust leaders, setting leaders, but also teachers and governors.
Brilliant. Thank you, Rachel. I think you've picked up there that one of the core threads from what you've all shared is the idea of action, and how we activate people and give people practical tools. So let me loop back to some of you. Audience, please do pop questions and comments into the chat. If you have specific questions for the panel, please type them and I can verbalise them for you. Otherwise, I'm going to freestyle it, which I'm quite comfortable doing. So Adam and Jo, let me come back to you two, because I am really curious about this idea of moving from like having conversations on a podcast to translate them into a book, because our tone, our rhetoric is quite different. Sort of like when we're not scripting it, and then when you see it written down. And my follow-up question to that is also around the kind of the safety of what we share on a podcast, and then seeing it in print. I'm sure you had to navigate that with some of your contributors. So, I mean, Jo, then Adam, do you want to both sort of like tag team on that answer?
That second part of the question was really important to us, because we're sharing the lived experiences, the lives of tens and tens of LGBT plus educators, and we wanted to make sure that what we were sharing felt accurate and real and right to their experience. So we took that really seriously. When I was writing the in practice section of these chapters, I listened back to the podcast. I listened to people speak several times over the course of kind of a few months, and tried to write into words. I didn't want to directly quote them. That didn't feel right. I wanted to write into words kind of what their experiences were. And then every story, every anecdote that is shared within the book, we then checked those with every individual to make sure they were happy with them. There was amendments and changes that came in, and every story, anecdote, or time when a person's voice is shared within the story has been approved by them, and is kind of written in a way that they were part of that journey.
Yeah, and I'll just echo what Jo said. Like, it's such a privilege to have the opportunity to amplify the voices of people, but it's also that massive responsibility. So we were really careful in terms of being selective about the things that we chose, but also recognizing that, taking them out of context didn't lose the value and the meaning, and having that feedback loop. Not only did we speak to each person whose story we shared, there was several people we trusted who read drafts for us, like Professor Catherine Lee, and she was a great help during the book in terms of signposting and giving us a steer on that. So yeah, so I think just trying to be as authentic as we can to the voices of the people we shared, and I feel like also discussing sensitive topics. We were conscious that at this current political climate, there's some pile-on sometimes when you discuss certain things linked to LGBT. So we were really, really careful about making sure what we were talking about was either factual or backed up by evidence. And so far, partly through luck and partly through being very, very careful, we've not really had much backlash. So long may that continue.
Well on both for creating that space, but also like creating that safety as well. Let me swing over to you then, Naomi, because I am curious about this idea of the two sisters having an Instagram account. I'm not great on Instagram. Instagram's where I put my holiday photos, but I know it is like the place to be for a lot of these conversations. And like making that bridge from quite short form on Insta, quite visual form, into longer form. How do you navigate that as a duo?
Yeah, we'd already written a book together previously. So our first book was called The Mixed Race Experience, which is for more sort of young adults and adults. And we did that in a really different way, actually. We'd already decided all the chapter headings. And then we just went away and had like a live Google Doc and would just add all these things to it. And we also interviewed people and had transcripts. So that kind of was done that way. But this one, actually, Natalie went away and did a whole first draft of the book. In fact, I did some, and we sent it back to the editors because I'd never written for this age group specifically, and they were like, "Oh no." You've written way I think I'd written for adults still. So Natalie was like, I think that I know the tone, and she went and did it and it was brilliant. And so I was like, okay, right, you've given me a great model here. So after she had kind of gone away and done it, and then I went back over and added to it and did some editing and reviewing and things like that. And also she's dyslexic, so one of the things that she does is she gets all her ideas down on paper, and then because I'm English and drama teacher, she'll like give it to me, and then I'll go and rework some things and help her with some of the spelling and punctuation and grammar and stuff. So we do make quite a good team in that respect. So it did work quite well. And then we had 4 guest authors, so they went away and literally just wrote their sections and then sent them back into us.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for sharing that. And Orleen, you referenced when in your 5 minutes that if you had more time, you'd like to talk about the time management, the self-discipline of writing. I think that's where you were going. Do you want to just share a little bit about that? Because the workload is excessive, and I think it puts a lot of people off. So how do you manage it?
Yeah, so it's really interesting because when I met my editor and I had to sort of submit my proposal, she basically said to me, she was great actually. First of all, I'd say that I would really like to say that I had an editor who she's of mixed race heritage. So there were things that I knew that she understood about the work that I was trying to do and about the challenges that I might face or the barriers in doing that. So she was fantastic. And she said to me, right, so you're going to write it in a year, so I'm going to go away and then come back in a year. And I was like, oh, no. I'm not doing that. You're not going anywhere in a year. I need feedback. I'm a teacher. I'm trained to give feedback. I need constant feedback. So she asked me to kind of think about it. And in the end, I said, because it was so new to me, that I would be much more comfortable if I got a clear steer from the very first chapter that I was speaking in the right way and to the right audience. So what we actually did is that I wrote a chapter every month. I would go to the library on a Saturday by myself for 6 hours. And every Saturday I would just sit and write, and I would create a chapter every month, which I would then send to her, get live feedback, which would then help me going forward and gave me the confidence. So that was because I had an editor that was I was able to say to her, I don't think that writing it for a year and coming back is going to be is going to work for me. I'm quite scared that won't do me well. And she was very open to that. And then we found a process that worked. And because I'm a mother of 3, I had to do it that way. I couldn't have to go away and come back a year later. I'm worried that I would have turned up with nothing in a year. So
I love that, because I think that chunking of it's a bit like having a gym buddy, isn't it? It's an accountability buddy to make sure you actually get up on a Saturday and go and get on your bike or whatever it is you're doing. So I do like that, and I know that different authors have different experiences with their editors, and some can be quite hands off. And if you need that kind of discipline, it's picking your publisher and picking your editor wisely, isn't it? Thank you. Last question then to Rachel. Rachel, it's a question that's come from one of the authors who's going to join us later on. You talked very openly and vulnerably there about the kind of the dilemma you grappled with about being a white author, about racial literacy. So the question is, how was your book received by the Black community? We know there's a lot being published at the moment about the lack of Black characters, Black authors, Black creators. So how's it landed? How's it resonated with your target audience?
Yeah, great question. So I think I was very upfront in the forward addressing that, in what I basically said earlier, but in a lot more detail, the dilemma and why I'd come to the conclusion that I should write the book. I was also really fortunate that I had a lot of endorsements and nice little sound bites about the book from prominent people of racially minoritized groups. I had a lovely quote from David Lammy on the cover, had an endorsement from Paul Miller, from Sufyan Sadiq, and a number of other really eminent and well-respected Black leaders in the field. I made the decision that I would interview and tell the stories interwoven through the book of 10 educators of colour, some of who've been head teachers or governors or subject teachers of different ages and with different experiences through the book. So there is a huge amount of telling the stories of people of colour in the book. You hear much less of my voice. But at places you do hear my voice, because I think white leaders sometimes need to be told by other white leaders, it's vital you do this, and it will be uncomfortable and you'll make mistakes and you'll take 1 step forward and 2 steps back. But, this is really important to do. We need everybody to be saying this, don't we? We need people of all backgrounds and all colours doing this. So it has gone down really well. I mean, I get booked often by white majority or exclusively white senior leadership teams to come and do work with them, because they say, we actually think it's powerful that a white person tells us what we should be doing in this space. But I also make sure that they're always backing that up with systemic and ongoing work with people with real lived experience. But I think the fact that there are a lot of case studies and a lot of stories of people of colour woven through the book probably helps with that.
Thank you for that, because I think it is just that tightrope, isn't it, that you navigate, but the mindfulness and the consciousness around it. And I think being that door opener to bring white people in who are a bit worried about what might happen in that conversation, you're almost laying the ground actually for other speakers and other trainers to come in. You might have noticed we had to boot out Joe and Adam. We are at capacity in our studio, so we wanted to make sure that our next authors were able to pull through so we can have a good transition. So a massive thank you to the authors who joined us for panel 1. You can see Rachel, Orleen and Naomi are still here. Joe and Adam, who just disappeared. Thank you for writing your books, for publishing your books, being part of our community, and we will continue to amplify the brilliant work you're doing. So please go and enjoy the rest of your World Book Day evening. We'll look forward to seeing you all soon. And Richard's going to be behind the scenes whisking these speakers away to bring the next panel forward. So thank you very much. Bear with us for a few seconds whilst panel 2 join the studio. Good evening, panel 2. It is lovely to see Bishma, Laura, Sarah and Troy. for part 2 of our World Book Day event. In this panel, we are thinking about the primary curriculum. So all of our authors who have joined us have worked in primary or have written books that primary schools can really leverage. We get quite a lot of pushback or questions sometimes about the age appropriateness of talking about isms and prejudice and diversity and identity. So our speakers are going to really speak to that for you. So same format. Each of the authors is going to have 5 minutes to talk us through the book they produced, they published, they authored, how it came to fruition. We'll hopefully have some comments and questions from you, the audience. Otherwise, I will do the Q&A at the end of the panel. So Bishma, you're up first. It's lovely to see you virtually after meeting you in person last term. Tell us all about the book that you've created.
Thank you ever so much for inviting me, Hannah. It's lovely to see you as well. So Amina and Amy. So I think it's a good point to start off with who we actually are as an organisation, because the book itself has been published by Educate Against Islamophobia. So just very, very briefly. So Educate Against Islamophobia, otherwise known as EAI for short, is a UK-wide not-for-profit organisation. And we work with schools up and down the country, so England, Scotland and Wales. And we help them to tackle Islamophobia. And we do that through 2 key avenues. So firstly, through the delivery of workshops to children and young people, and also the delivery of CPD to practitioners working with those children. And then secondly, through the production and dissemination of teaching and learning materials. And of course, that's where the storybook Amina and Amy falls. And just very, very briefly, in terms of the issue that we aim to kind of tackle through the storybook Amina and Amy. So Islamophobia, and in the interest of our audience who's watching, just very, very briefly. So Islamophobia, it is a form of racism, and it is a form of racism that isn't actually just limited to certain pockets and areas within the UK. It's actually a global phenomenon that is sadly intensifying in recent times. And if we kind of rewind to 1997, when Runnymede Trust actually coined the term Islamophobia in their landmark report, Islamophobia, A Challenge for Us All, they actually found that Muslims were excluded from employment, they were discriminated against in the provision of health and education services, and they were victims of prejudice in the media and everyday conversations. And then if we kind of fast forward to 2017, when Runnymede Trust actually published their 20th anniversary report, they actually found that Islamophobia as a phenomenon has become a lot more complex and entrenched within society. So as an organisation, as I've already mentioned, excuse me, we're there, we produce teaching and learning materials to tackle Islamophobia, and we're really hopeful that the storybook Amina and Amy actually tackles Islamophobia, and in particular through it within an early years setting.
Fabulous, thank you for that context, because it is stark, isn't it? And a lot of the prejudice we're tackling through our books is on the increase rather than on the decrease. So thank you for doing a book that really gets the younger children engaged in these conversations. So thank you, Bishma. I'm going to swing over to Laura, the lovely Laura. Laura and I have had so many emails and DMs, and to be in the same space as you finally, Laura, it's not in person, but at least we're on the StreamYard together. It's fab to see you. And I know you've written lots of books, Laura, so you're going to spotlight your newest book tonight, aren't you?
Yes, which is My Family, Your Family. And this actually came about, so just a tiny bit, I've only got 5 minutes myself. I worked in early years, many years ago, the last 20 years, consultancy work, global level as well. And I created a children's TV show called Jojo and Gran Gran, which is the first Black British animation. Come on. And also I've written a book called My Skin, Your Skin, which is for racism, anti-racism and empowerment. And this is the latest book. So it came about because around 10 years ago, and it's quite fitting because on Sunday we've got Mother's Day. So I was just getting really tired of the commercialism of Mother's Day and Father's Day. And for many of our children, they do not fit into Mother's Day and Father's Day. So I started My Family Week as a celebration. And after writing My Skin, Your Skin, conversation with my publisher, then I wrote My Family, Your Family, which is, you always have to big up the illustrators, which is Giovanna Mendres, and she did a fantastic job. So in this book, I celebrate children who are adopted, children who are fostered, children who live in same-sex or same-gender families. I'm using the correct terms. I talk about surrogacy as well in the book, donorship. I don't shy away from that because that is the reality for many children. I talk about children who may have had a parent who have been bereaved. I talk about children who may care for a parent or care for a sibling. And what I've included in this book, and it's raised awareness on so many different levels, are children who are actually in kinship care. So these are children who are either with a grandparent or another sibling in some cases, I've heard. And I had many of these speakers. I had a big conference book launch in October, and it really touched the hearts and the minds of the audience. And one of the things that I really wanted to do in this book was include the voice of the Gypsy, Roma and travelling community. So over the last 4 years, my leaning in and listening has been to that community. I can't stand here as a Black woman and say I'm anti-racist, etc., if I don't start leaning in and listening. And our learning is never done. We're always learning as, you know, working in education. I'm verbally dyslexic, colleagues, you can probably hear, in education. So Lisa Smith, who was from the Travelling Roma Gypsy Roma and Travelling Community, she actually works for the Travellers' Time. She was a sensitive reader on this book. And I met Lisa, not in England, just showing off because I work globally in New Zealand. I said, you're from England, I'm from England. And I always start with, tell me your story. And that way you find out so much. So Lisa and I connected, I recorded a podcast. She's the sensitive reader. And I included the Gypsy, Roma and Travelling Community in this book. Lisa spoke at my conference, and we've probably all done this as a child, where we've asked to draw our homes. Lisa said as a child in school, she started to draw a caravan. She looked over at her friends and they were all drawing homes. So she rubbed it out. That was the first bit of shame she felt about her community. I shared that last year. I was doing a keynote at a conference. A teacher came over to me, white, visually white, quote unquote. She burst into tears. And she said to me, I'm a teacher, not in my teacher training, Laura, not in any CPD has anybody ever talked about my community. And she said to me, it was tears for joy. Yeah, but I have so much to say, as you can see. But thank you. And thank you to all the other contributors. I'm enjoying it. And thank you for hosting, Hannah.
My pleasure, Laura. And I've gifted your 2 books to so many friends for their children. I know it's on a lot of bookshelves around the country of my personal network. So thank you for writing the 2 books. Sarah, you're another one who we keep missing each other. We've tried to connect so many times. It's so nice to finally be in the same space together. And I can't wait to hear about the book that you published. Was it last year now as well? Over to you, Sarah.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. So my book is called Time to Shake Up the Primary Curriculum, which was published actually this time last year. And so why I wrote the book was, so at the point in which I wrote the book, I started writing the book, I was a deputy head teacher. And I've always led on curriculum. I've always tried to create a representative curriculum so that all children can be seen. And in the wake of George Floyd and the sort of resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, I started to really take the time to really reflect on my own lived experience as a child within education, as a young person within education. And then I started to wonder whether other people had the same experiences. So I sit at an intersection of being a mixed race female, and I'm also queer. And so I started to kind of do a little bit of research around different educators, and I found that lots of people had similar experiences. So what I wanted to do is I initially rewrote the curriculum in my own school to make sure that it was inclusive of lots of different voices, to try and kind of disrupt the white-centric, heteronormative narrative, which threads throughout our curriculum, throughout the national curriculum, actually, but that's a different conversation. And so I tried to kind of develop each subject separately. So it included the voices and the perspectives of people of colour, women, neurodiversity, LGBTQIA+ community. And then, yeah, so I did the curriculum at my own school, and it was really successful. Lots of children made lots of progress and engagement improved. And I wrote a tweet about it, and somebody got in contact and said, that sounds great. Do you want to write a book about it? I literally never thought about writing a book. And I said, yeah, okay, fine. So he gave me a contact for somebody at Bloomsbury. And I honestly never thought, A, that I could ever write a book, or B, that if I did decide to write a book, that anyone would ever say yes to my idea. And they did. So that's sort of how that happened, which was really, really lovely. And kind of in between all of this happening, was lockdown. I left a really I left a marriage that I wasn't feeling particularly safe in, and I also lost my dad, and it all happened at one time. So I found writing the book a real amazing experience, actually, transformational, really. And I guess the impact that I would like it to have is, I really want people, educators, to move from this idea of a diverse curriculum as something being static. Like, oh, we've looked at it and we've included X, Y, and Z voices, we're done. It's not that at all. We are constantly on a journey, and I would love to say, and I hope that actually we've moved on even further from when this was published last year. I would really love educators to think about that kind of struggle versus joy dichotomy, in that, okay, yes, that's great if we can include lots of Black voices, for example, but if all that we're presenting to children is struggle, are we actually doing more damage? Is that actually helpful? Is that actually diverse? And so I guess what I want the impact of the book to be is for educators to, A, know that it is a journey, it isn't a destination, and B, to start having those conversations about inclusivity, real inclusivity, to be able to audit both the curriculum, but also the people who are auditing the curriculum. Because if it is always the same voices are auditing a curriculum, then you're always going to get the same output. So yeah, that's me.
Awesome. I love the title. I love a shake up. So shaking up the curriculum is definitely something that's resonant with lots of the authors tonight. So thank you, Sarah. Last but not least, Troy, great to see you again. I know you've also written a number of different books. So which one are you going to talk to us about tonight?
Well, first of all, I'm just going to say I really am buzzing with the love in the room. Sarah, a lot of what you're saying there, it's kind of resonated very much with me. So I'm a former head teacher as well. I'm going to talk about my second book, which is this one, The Most Contented Snail in the Whole Wide World. And this was the second book in a series that they all promote marginalised sectors. This was my first one. I'm going to share that very cheekily as well. I wrote my first story because two children being picked on for having same-sex parents. And the school where I was working was very white working class, very homophobic, very racist. And because, like some other people who are on here today, they've experienced being marginalised themselves, and I certainly had as a queer man growing up, and certainly growing through Section 28. And so I wanted to give a voice to young people, and also to give representation. And so I was really pleased because Contented Snail, I tend to shorten them because the titles are quite long, but Contented Snail was actually written with some of the children in my school as we'd gone on that journey of developing more open-mindedness and encouraging people to think more diversely. And it was written in response to a Year 5 wanting to be known by different pronouns. And so this book then takes a couple of characters from the first from the first story, and they go off to snail school and meet a slug that wants to be a snail. And I specifically chose animals because we'd introduced pets into school, but also children love animals, and it's actually very difficult to have an argument about animals. So I tried to work through that. I've literally just released my third book. I'm going to squeeze that one in as well. Most Flamboyant Flamingos in the Whole Wide World. And this amplifies the voice of bisexuality. And for me, one of the joyous things that I find now, so I take my books into schools and I lead a lot of workshops, and I particularly use Contented Snail because I encourage the children to write their own stories, and we have kind of like worksheets that the children can use to create their own mini books. And I encourage them to use my stories to parody their own stories so that they can then feel that they can get their voice out, because ultimately the key thing for me is picture books are a really beautiful way of giving visual representation for all. And ironically, this morning I was in an infant school, and I was doing an assembly with one of my books, and one of the children that put their hands up, apparently afterwards the head teacher said they were so thrilled that they spoke out because they're normally really, really quiet, and this particular child had got two mums. and the fact that he felt able to talk about that. And I'm sure that's exactly how you guys feel. It's about giving people the opportunity to feel represented in picture books. So I think I've just about touched on everything I wanted to there, but yeah, the work that you're all doing is amazing. And thank you, Hannah.
Thank you, Troy. And audience, please do pop questions and reflections in the chat there for our 4 authors on this panel. There's so many things I want to kind of put on there, but I think you summed it up there, Troy, about this idea of helping people to find and use their own voices. That you've all found your own voices as authors, but you're helping young people find their voices. And Laura, I wanted to come back to something that you said about being dyslexic, because I know a lot of dyslexic educators who want to blog and want to write articles and would love to write a book, but they worry that they haven't got the skills to do that. How did you navigate your dyslexia to find words and to create so much content?
Yeah, thank you for that, Hannah. I had about 600 schools on today for World Book Day on Zoom, and that was one of the questions that came up. And I used to feel really ashamed, getting quite emotional actually, because my sister was quite academic and I wasn't, and I really struggled in primary school. But when I got to secondary school, I found my voice, but I am still this quiet person inside. And I felt, even when I was up until about, I think about 25, and then it was actually a lecturer said to me, just write, Laura, just write on the board, because I was always shying away from it when I transitioned into adult education. And I share that story because it's about, I love the term empowerment. So it's about empowering then the young people when I go into schools and I say to them, who's dyslexic, if I'm doing an assembly, and a few of them put up their hands, and I use the quote, but it hasn't stopped me from what I'm doing. And the quote says, don't let what you can't do interfere with what you can do. And I know sometimes on the socials that I make mistakes, but I think it is important that people don't put me on this pedestal, that I have my flaws, and that I can say that I mispronounce words. Hannah, you're an English teacher, you probably picked it up quite a lot of me talking, but I just think it's really good that where possible, people are able to show up who they are and don't feel embarrassed about it if they can, because some people choose not to. I mean, my older son's autistic. He doesn't like people really knowing, so to speak, but great question. Thank you.
And no, I don't pick it up at all, because I've got a mild speech impediment that I had as a child, and it took me a long time to actually do public speaking because I was so conscious of it. So I try really hard to not then pick up on other people's things, because for me, that's the beauty of it and the modelling of it. And I was just thinking about the links between you, Laura, and Sarah, about intersectional identities where you are more than what we can see. So Sarah, let me just pick that up with you, because race is like the visible identity that you hold. Being a woman is the visible identity, but you talked about being a queer educator as well, and the intersect of all those different jigsaw pieces of you. How do you help people to understand the bits that are less visible? Is that quite a big question? But I think there's a piece there about what schools focus on. They often focus on the bits that are visible.
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually think it is quite an enormous question as well. I think that, for me, what's really important as an educator is to present children with the world around them and the people around them. And that sometimes includes the people within our community, but in communities that are homogenous, it also includes people that are outside of that immediate local community. And I think that, through text and through literacy is one of the most powerful ways that we can, expose children to stories, because actually the bottom line is about humanity. That's what it is. It's about humanity. And I think bringing it down to that is the most important thing.
I completely agree. Bishwa, I'm going to come back to you. We know there's an increased level of hate directed towards your community, your identity group, the Islamophobia, the hate crimes. And I think there's often a fear of talking about that in a primary context. So you deliberately wrote a book for a younger audience. How's it been received by different communities? I'm curious for the audience to hear how you've positioned and pitched it to that younger audience.
Yeah, so it's interesting you mentioned that, Hannah, because if we take a look at the research and the statistics, and they show that children as young as the age of 3 can actually exhibit the racist attitudes. So we're very conscious to kind of create teaching learning materials with that age range in mind. And the way in which we've kind of done it is we've kind of tackled the issue through various themes and lenses, but then also through Rudine Sims Bishop's notion of children's literature acting as the mirrors, the windows, and the sliding glass doors. And in terms of the book itself, it follows the protagonist, Amina and Amy, who's quite nervous and anxious about starting her first day of school or nursery. But then as we kind of as her day unfolds and she meets the various kind of classmates, she notices that there are lots more similarities than differences that she actually had anticipated. And it goes back to that kind of idea of the mirrors, the windows, and the sliding glass doors. So if we just kind of touch upon the mirror, for example, for those children who may identify obviously as Muslim and who belong to the Islamic faith, it's very important to have characters and protagonists that actually reflect them. For those who may not actually belong to the Islamic faith and who may not be familiar with some of the practices of the Islamic faith, it's a very good kind of window to actually see the life of Amina and how she goes about her daily kind of her life and some of the practices. And we kind of aim to do that in a very subtle way through the imagery that you'll see. So for example, you'll see in Amina's bedroom that there's a prayer mat on the floor, just very gently touching on those aspects of Islamic identity. And in terms of how it's been kind of received by the community, just yesterday actually I was at an event in Westminster and there was a lady who approached me and she said that she's got a 3-year-old grandson who she's read the storybook to, and he's just so keen every night to read the story over and over again. And I think part of that, kind of what reflects that kind of excitement in children and young people, is that strong imagery. And we're very conscious as well when we were creating the storybook to make sure that it was very much rich in those images. And that's the kind of core theme and context throughout the theme or throughout the course of the book.
Brilliant, thank you, Bishma. And staying on the thread of imagery, Troy, I was just googling the book. I love the book Tango Makes Three, or Tango Comes Three, and the penguins, and how we introduce what might seem like adult themes, but through animal imagery. Was that a conscious decision to use animals as a vehicle because of how much fear and pushback and stigma there is sometimes talking about LGBTQ identities within a primary classroom? Do you want to speak a little bit more about your positioning?
Yeah, so ironically, actually, we have used Tango Makes Three, and I love that story. The children really love that story. So when I first arrived at the school, there were lots of homophobic and racist remarks that were just being bandied about in the playground and not being challenged. And part of the reason why I decided to go down the route of using animals was because, as I said, we'd introduced animals into the school. And for me, it gets around the whole, because I think a lot of this is around fear. And people are, prejudices are born in fear. And so I think if we kind of open people's minds and do it in a gentle format, Bishma, I think what you're saying about the subtleties of images within picture books, it's a great thing. And for me, it's that subtlety of, well, actually, it's a family of flamingos over my back, over my shoulder there. Or it's just a couple of mummy snails. And so you can lighten the discussion, and that then opens up to have more in-depth conversations. And I mean, I've used my books with children as young as 4, 3 and 4. And in fact, actually, I had a reading session where the youngest child there was 6 weeks old. And it's about exposing the children to these images now and when they are very young. And then you can use the same books to actually talk about the rationale behind developing the books. And I've literally worked in primary school and secondary this week, talking about using the same books, but from a different perspective.
Brilliant, thank you, Troy. I'm going to come back to Laura for my final question, because we've talked in the previous panel about like going from a podcast to a book or Instagram to a book, but you've got animation, like you've got a whole different scale, Laura. How did you end up creating animation? And if people are curious about that pathway, any tips?
Yeah, because because I was doing the consultancy work with brands, sort of like leaning in on the diversity and inclusion with family life, children. I was working on a TV show. I had already written the first Jojo and Gran book. A colleague from the BBC was there. Went over to have a cup of tea and I said, oh, I've got an idea. But actually it was rejected 4 or 5 times. But one of the things that I do is, because I always get asked, how do I do children's books? How do I do children's TV? I do a free session once a year called Laura, How Do I? And the next one's in May sometime in the evening. Last year I had about 40 people join on because I can't meet everybody. I want to help and pass the baton on. So if anybody's interested, it's free. It's for an hour in May and I can go into a bit more detail. But that's how, and I still do early years education work because I love it. Thank you.
I love that, Laura. And please do send us the details of that event and we can
I
put it
will
out to
do,
the network.
1,000,000%. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure
Thank
lots of
you
people would love to join you. So can I say a massive thank you to our panelists from panel 2. Fab to see you all, meet you all, have you all on the screen at the same time. Thanks for the great work you're doing to really have these conversations right there at the start of education. It's so important. I think so many schools and educators are scared, but you're giving them the tools and the resources to really open up those conversations. So thank you for all the work you're doing. You may now all disappear and go and put the kettle on and enjoy your evening. And we're going to welcome panel 3 onto the screen. So thank you, everyone. Take care. Good evening, everyone, and welcome back for our 3rd panel. In this panel, we are exploring the more macro theme of the school system, the global school system, because we have some international educators on this panel. So I'm delighted to be joined by Andre, by Nagel, and by Yamina. And we are a person down. The lovely Lekka's not very well tonight, so she sends her apologies. Hopefully we'll get her on a future event. So same format, 5 minutes for each of you. We've got a little bit longer for the Q&A on this one. So audience, please do pop some questions and some thoughts in the chat for our 3 authors. So Andre, it's fab to finally see you. I know we've had a few emails over the last year or so. Tell us all about the book that you have produced and published, and how you became a writer and how you got the book published.
Sure, thank you, Hannah. If I can just start by obviously thanking you for organising the event, and it's incredibly amazing how fast a year goes by, isn't it? Since that email that popped in the inbox from you. Yeah, so this is my book, Leading Your International School. They say never judge a book by its cover, but I mean, come on, seriously, I think you will rarely find a book that has a better cover than that. So, yeah, I moved internationally in 2015. And I'd been working in a state school in the UK for around about 8 years. And, you know, I've had some incredible experiences in Malaysia and China. But it didn't take long actually to realize from my perspective that the navigation, the territory of working internationally, it was very different to working over back in the UK in terms of compliance, in terms of policy, in terms of curriculum or professional development. Things were done very differently. And then I started to hear of this word nuance that crept in, you know, Michael Fullan's work, you know, the nuanced leader. So I started to scribe. I started to write my thoughts down. I'd started doing an MA in educational leadership. I was doing my NPQSL at the time. And I couldn't wait to get home. And I was just writing and writing and writing, aimlessly almost. I didn't really know what I was writing about. I'd used a framework that I'd found, some of the framework from the Ontario Leadership Framework. And I just began to analyze everything that I was doing, the school was doing from a leadership perspective. And it became a really invigorating tool for me, a really kind of cleansing process to go through. And of course, there were great things that the school was doing. There were some not so great things that the school was doing. Some professional development would come and go. And so I kind of looked at myself and I thought, well, why is that? What's the longevity here? You know, what's the culture at the school? Can the culture really stand up to, you know, withstand the challenges that the professional development needs to? There were things that would crop up perennially in human resource, in HR. You know, sometimes internationally, the professionalization of HR isn't quite like it is back in the UK. We've been fortunate in the UK that the professionalization of human resource management has been, you know, for the last 10, 20, 30 years. So I really began to pick up that there were these key differences between how schools abroad and overseas were developed, how they were led and how they were managed. Once I got to about 40,000 words, probably the biggest mistake I ever made was that I started to pitch it to publishers, and I had this incoherent piece of text, you know, that was nothing like probably it would be. And I think some publishers sort of turned around and said, thanks, but no thanks. So, you know, one of the biggest pieces of advice that I would give to people is, if you are sending off something to a publisher, make sure it's clean, make sure it's near enough as you want it to be, and it supports who you are and kind of the process that you've gone through, and it's really demonstrating kind of the best of your abilities. So I wrote 9 chapters on vision, values and virtues, human resource management, leading and managing an international school culture, barriers that international schools leaders face. At the beginning of each chapter, I introduce a narrative. I like stories, I like narratives. I think it helps to kind of set the scene with the story. So if I just give you one example of the narrative that I used, you know, the ship-breaking yard in the Alang, people breaking up huge cruise ships with their bare hands, you know, bare feet. And the idea was that, you know, we're very privileged in international schools. You know, quite often we think that we've had a bad day, but we're paid very well for what we do. You know, we get the chance to work internationally. So being as an international school leader, putting that into perspective, really saying that actually, you know, we're not in a bad place. From that, you know, our 3 core values are now ethical leadership, opportunity, and sustainability. So I'm really, really trying to spread the idea that anybody can lead an international school, that anybody should be able to lead an international school. It's not just preserve of people that look like me.
Brilliant, Andre. Thank you so much. And what's your hashtag? What's LYIS?
Leading your international school.
Oh, you've got your own hashtag for your book there. Sorry, I wasn't joining at the dots. Thank you, Andre. I'm going to swing over to Nagel then. Dr. Barker, nice to see you. And I think you've just finished one book, but I think you're doing a call out for the next book. So tell us about your writing projects.
Good evening, everyone. Good to see you, Hannah. Nice to see you again. Andre, I think I'm crossing paths with you quite a few times, but it's the first time I'm seeing you, and I'm sure we'll have some connections to make. And yeah, Mina, I haven't met you yet, but I'm sure I'll regret not knowing you from a long time before in my life. So great. Yes. So interestingly, Andre's story links nicely to the kind of thing that happened. I went internationally in 2012. So I've been working in the UK state system before that, decided to try international. And one of the things that I at the time when you're in it, I didn't recognize it as being anything unique. I think when I began to understand international education more was when I began to do my doctoral studies. And during the studies, it was so many times you'd read articles or read publications that people would say it's an under-researched area. And I found that quite fascinating, that an area that had so much dynamics to it, so much things happening in it, fast growing in terms of how it was massively expanding internationally, was seen as under-researched or unresearched for that matter. So I, at the time while doing my doctorate, I was kind of concerned that I couldn't find enough resources to support my work. But then as I dug, I realized that there was something. It's just that no one had started to answer that question in a way that said emphatically that there is some research, but also set the stage. So that gave me the inspiration, like, they say if you want, you can wait for somebody to do something or you be that somebody. So that's when I came up with the idea of putting together a handbook of research on critical issues and global trends in international education, which I have here for people to see. It's a massive tome, 744 pages. It is a collaborative work of 24 different chapters written by experts within the international field. Lots of names that you will see and go, wow, those people are in it. A classic example, the foreword was written by Lee Webb and Nick Brummett from ISC Research, which is like the leading research company in that field. If you look through, you'll see a lot of people in this. There's a lot of papers covering the length and breadth of topics right across international school. And so this book has already massively taken off. I did this book in collaboration with two other colleagues. One works with the ISPP, works at Northern Arizona University. They have a massive international training program. And Liam, who is a head of school at International School of Lusaka. So we collaborated on this, and it took us a year to get, we started off with 62 proposals. And then by the time we had about 48 chapters to work with, and in the end we selected 24 that was ready to go. So this is out there now, and anybody who is researching, this is going to be an intersection for any research written in the next couple of years in international school, because pretty much everyone who had anything out was getting those inside of this book. Now, you did signpost the fact that I do have a second on waiting, because I was kind of going to wait and see what happened, but I've gotten so many people contacting me. So we just put a call for paper out for the next one, just called Issues and Trends for International School Leadership, which kind of intersects with what Andre is doing. And so it is just, and that already we have had maybe about 15 proposals already through that. So that's really going fine. I think there's a nice little thing to say here. Now, prior to this book, I'd not published, but I've started like 25 different books, like started a lot of books, but never get there. When I say books, that's a very loose way to think about it. But I always wanted to write a book. And I think what I did was I started a podcast called Your Book, Your Story to try and figure out why people, what they did to overcome that kind of fear of writing a book, and I kind of reached out to people who had written only one book or written their first book. And so I listened to their story, and it was a bit of a narcissistic, it was more like for myself rather than for them. I wanted to hear their stories. And to be fair, it really motivated me. And I realized that their story was no different from mine. They just did it. And so that helped me to push through. So my thing is that this is a massive contribution to a field that is considered to be unresearched, under-researched. And my answer to that question that, is it isn't under research, but what we didn't have was a kind of compilation of the resources of a research. So what we have here is one step, and I'm continuing to add more and more to that. And a lot of people feel like this is a nice brick in the wall of research for everyone to know about. So thanks
I think brick's the right word, Michael. Like Richard has put in the chat, that's a beast of a book. It's a big old book. So you're not going to miss it on a bookshelf, are you? Awesome, thank you so much. Last but not least, then, Yamina, your book is whisked away to the publishers. It's not actually been printed yet. Tell the listeners, tell the audience all about the book that you have been working on. I know you're still in shock that you've actually written a book and it's not here with us yet, but share your story with us.
It doesn't help my imposter syndrome when I see that beast of a book. Come on. It has inspired me though, so thank you so much. So hi everyone. I finished after about 2 years writing a book called Thriving in Your First Years of Teaching. So I'm going to start with the other way around about the publishers, because that's actually the reason why I decided to write the book. I was approached by Delana Spencer from Sage Publishing, who contacted me through my blog and said, oh, look, I've been reading some of your blogs. I've heard about the work that you're doing with early career teachers, but also just beyond. And I wondered if you could have a chat. And I've always said I would never write a book. I just don't have the time for it. I'm currently a deputy head teacher, but I'm always also, for those of you who don't know, I do lots of other little things, and everyone says I'm always everywhere, but that's just because I love education and I'm really passionate about it. But I just never thought I'd be passionate enough to write a book. I'm also dyslexic, dyspraxic, and lots of other protected characteristics. Hannah talks about it almost like me collecting them like Pokemon cards. But I just never thought of it. And it was Delana who said, look, if you don't write this, who will? And we had a few options, and she gave, we talked it through, and she said, what are the kind of things that you're really passionate about in education? And it came out from that discussion that I was really passionate about keeping teachers in education, that in the UK we have a ridiculous number of colleagues who are leaving the profession, and colleagues who started with me in 2009 have left the profession, and 13-14 years on I'm still in it. And I wondered why that might be the case. And one of the reasons I felt that was because at the early career stage, on the first few years of teaching, we don't nurture that amazing talent, those colleagues who are coming in, who are passionate, who are excited. And something the system does through workload and through many other factors just seems to kill it out of them, and means that they're just spat out of that system that really needs them, who are passionate educators about their subject or their phase or those children. And so that's how I was like, okay. And she persuaded me through that and said, look, this is your legacy. You talk to me about your legacy. This is it. And I was like, damn it. And I'm not going to lie, I gave her those words because I said, my mum and dad always said teaching is a legacy. And she just knew what to say. And so I ended up saying yes. And I always felt like an imposter. And Hannah knows, because Hannah's had to meet me lots of times over the last year to try and hold me to account. I really need accountability. Somebody to hold me to account. And Delaney, my editor, is absolutely sensational, just fantastic, kind of really, really positive. But I also need a bit of a hard line. And that's what Hannah did for me. And I love it because, I know that this is the book that is needed for those early career teachers, but also beyond, I hope. And I wrote it because I struggled as an NQT. I, used to get these RIs, requires improvement, inspectors would come in and say, well, she's not good enough to teach. Is she ready to teach? It was quite challenging for me. And I can't believe that now, all these years later, I'm here and I'm a deputy head. And I wonder that if my mentors had given up on me, if I hadn't met the people I had through my coaches and mentors, would I still be here? Maybe I would be one of those statistics. And so having struggled, what I've done in this book is, written the book that I needed in 2009 and written the book. So much of what I do is I consume knowledge. I love reading so much about education, and sometimes it's a bit too much. And I wanted to write a book that was small. It's about 10,000, 15,000, I think it's about 15,000 words. Very small, snappy, 5 chapters, but people, they can flick in and out, whenever they need it. And the chapters include things like, thriving in your early career school, to thriving in your classroom, to thriving, thinking about your workload and well-being, and things that I thought were practical strategies to help them stay in education, understand that they're not alone. And I think sometimes, particularly when you're new to teaching, you just feel like you're just surviving. And that's why the title is Thriving, because that's exactly what we need our educators to be doing. And it's not because they don't want to, it's because the system is really challenging at the moment, particularly if you're in the UK. It's a really challenging system. So I hope that this book provides our colleagues with really practical strategies to really break those things down. Like, I was never taught, how do I set cover? What do I do if I'm not meant to be in? Or how do I do those basic things? Or how do I actually manage that workload? Like, somebody plans a lesson in 10 minutes and I'm sitting here 3 hours later trying to plan. And the book gives those practical strategies based on my experience, but based on colleagues who I've worked with. And I've had some amazing colleagues like Hannah Wilson share their wisdom and their voice with the readers. And so I hope that the readers will really benefit from that practical kind of advice, that wisdom, and that experience and expertise. And hopefully, my aim, and it's a big one, is to keep more teachers in education as a result of that book.
Fabulous, Yamina. Thank you. I love the fact you always call me Hannah Wilson rather than Hannah. There's a few questions from the audience about how do they pre-order. I've said if they Google the Little Guide series of Yamina Bibi, there is a pre-order, isn't there?
Yes, there is. I mean, yeah, I keep giving that link as well, and everyone's like, "Oh, it's not even arrived yet." I'm like, guys, because I know, and
it was supposed to be here in June, and it's now going to be out in September, isn't it? So we need to wait a little bit longer, but it will be with us soon. And you use the word legacy. I'm going to come back to you, Andre, because you used the word longevity, and I want to pull some threads here out from what the three of you spoke about, because this idea of longevity and legacy in an international context. I'm just back from the UAE visiting international schools over there. I know the kind of mobility, the turnover of international staff can be quite high. So tell us a little bit about how you explored that theme within your book.
Yeah, and I'm sure probably it's something that Dr. Barker has also explored in his book. I think there's some research that varies between 18 months and 2.5 years. but again, it's very hard to uncover that research. So what we want to do is we really want to ask those questions. We want to put those questions front and center and say, look, is this a reality? Where is it a reality? Is this in North or South America? Is it in Asia? Is it in Europe? What are these situations? Is it a relationship between board, owners, governance model, and principal? Are principals doing due diligence when it comes to the contract, that they're signing? Are they signing up for things that they don't really realize that they're going to be held accountable for? So I think moving forward, what we want to do is we want to become a sounding board for international school leaders who can approach us, who can say to us, look, I am thinking about working such and such a country. What are the cultural nuances that I really need to be aware of? Just something simple as, being in China, putting your hand on, a child's head, something like that we've grown up and doing something, but it's deemed very culturally insensitive and inappropriate within Asia. So, yeah, it's a huge area for exploration. I mean, data from the Council of International Schools still reveals that around 85% of international school leaders are still male, white males. So we have a huge way to go in terms of leveling up international school leadership. And that's my mission. My mission is to level up international school leadership. I want to be that person who really instigates a change, and a change for the good.
Thank you, Andre. And I want to pick that up as a thread for Magor about global majority international leaders, because it is a white majority space from my experience of visiting a small patch, the UAE. And there was a really interesting panel at the conference I went to, the Teach Middle East Leadership Conference. And there was a panel that discussed racial equity, racial representation in particular. Is there a section of your academic book, your research, that looks at race and racial representation in particular?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, it's 24 different writers. We do have a lot of I'd say maybe a quarter of the chapters in the book looks at equity in the international space. We have one from Dr. Hammer that looks at how local teachers in some countries are paid at different rates compared to international teachers. That's an interesting one. It's called The Elephant in the Staff Room. That's an interesting one to look at. There are some that looks at the feelings of belonging for teachers in those spaces, and why some teachers of that's like Africa. This one's a specific one about African American teachers, why they don't feel comfortable in many of those spaces, because it's just not a space that is quite welcoming for them. We have some that looks at students from non-elite backgrounds that are in some schools of this nature. So then we're talking also, it gets into the kind of equity in terms of language, multilingualism, and so on. So what we have got here is a compendium of research that pretty much opens, it brings it together and have it's a conversation starter. So many of these papers are research papers, but what they do is open the conversation for other people to explore. What I was hoping to do is just create a gateway for that to happen. And I think the response from the international community is that we really needed this, because now people can maybe refer to this or refer to a piece of research that is out there. We do have a few papers as well that are written as essays that challenge, for example, the IB and its ideals, and whether it lives up to its ideals. As you go further up, you realize it's a very, it's not a very layered organization or diverse organization in terms of how it is set up as well. So there are some real interesting papers there, because that was the idea, that it wasn't my thoughts only that is in it. So, I think that's the whole point of the book, is that it is research value.
Brilliant, thank you, Magor. And coming back to you, Yamina, I'm really conscious that we're actually losing a lot of ECTs to the international schools market, because I can see the appeal, and I know there's a lot of data around that. But the last time I looked at the data around ECT retention, I think it's 36% of teachers leave after their third year in the UK, and 50% by the fifth year. So for all of that investment of recruiting and developing early career teachers, they don't last very long. So how do you hope that your book might impact and slow down some of the attrition?
I think the key thing is sometimes colleagues feel alone, and they feel like their voices aren't heard, or they feel like the issue that they're facing is just theirs and it must be them. But what I do in the book is share that actually these things happen to me, where I've had kids throw chairs in my classroom, and now I'm deputy head of behavior, or actually I struggle to plan lessons, or I got a requires improvement in one of my first lesson observations, and now I became a lead practitioner. So I give real kind of scenarios and strategies to essentially say you're not alone. These things happen to us all, but there's also ways to overcome it. Here's some strategies to help you. Here's some reading that you can do. Here's some things, people you can go to really support it. The other thing that I do in the book is talk about building a network. And I think as I've moved through my career, that's what I've been really lucky to be able to build. And again, these are things that you're never taught. Some people it looks like they just know how to do it. But the thing is, we all know somebody. I've modeled that on you, Hannah. I've observed you. I've watched you. You are my role model when it comes to networking and building that network, and it's real inspiration for me. And so sharing some of that, how do we build that network, and how do we leverage our networks to support us personally and professionally? And I think so much of this has become, these are professional selves, and that, our work, we talk about work-life balance, but something that Hannah taught me was about work-life harmony. I love my job. I actually do a lot of work outside of school because I find it fun. And always people say, oh, why do you enjoy that? Because it's my red thread. It's what I love doing, and I'll do it, I think, for the rest of my life. But making people feel like it's one or the other, when actually these are the whole selves. And when you're thinking about educators, when I'm thinking about my friends who started the careers with, our careers together, lots of them are in the Middle East, and they've gone because there's a real drive. It's almost, rather than it being a pull factor, I feel like it's a push factor in the UK at the moment. Unfortunately, the workload is humongous. Schools aren't helping by adding constantly new things to do, shiny things to do. And so it feels easier to just go. And I have lots of friends who've done this, go to the Middle East, go somewhere else where they can just be a teacher. And I use that word just. I have lots of experienced colleagues who have gone from senior leadership positions to just being a teacher because it's easier, it's better pay, and they've got harmony. That they go and sit in the sun for a few hours. They get to spend time with their families. There's so many benefits. And I'm not going to lie, I'm very close to going to Qatar last year. My friends are always saying, come to Dubai. And I'm like, oh, I love Dubai. And there's so much of a draw there. And for people from diverse backgrounds like myself, the draw of, I'm not going to lie, a Muslim country where everything's halal is also a huge draw. So what are schools doing to create inclusive schools that create a sense of belonging is something that I also tackle in the book. How can you as a teacher kind of create those sense of kind of inclusive networks for yourself and leverage that? Because I know Diverse Ed, Women Ed, BAME Ed have created those spaces for me and have helped me feel that sense of belonging. It's probably why I've stayed for so long in education and in the UK when, Middle East has been calling me for a very long time.
Thank you, Yamina. And I think that push me, pull you. I'm going to come to you on that, Andre, if that's okay, around what's pushing people from the UK to go international, or what's pulling people to go international. Is that a theme that you explore in the book around recruitment?
Yeah, it's a really good question and topic that we discussed yesterday. Actually, in our podcast, we had a lady called Anna Peake, who's at Shrewsbury School. She actually worked abroad in the early noughties, and she's come back. She talked about how it, really adds value to people the other way around. If we flip the model, for years we've thought that people are leaving, they're leaving, they're deserting. But if we actually see that it as a well-being tool, if we actually understand that, from a cultural perspective, from diversity, from me, I have a Chinese partner, I've worked in Malaysia. I'm going back to Malaysia in a month's time. I have friends, great Muslim friends. So it really has added to me as an individual that I can then come back to this country and I really appreciate even more that cultural diversity than I did. So I think, yes, we do have a crisis, but I think if schools were open-minded about how they, can really see it as a strength rather than a weakness, I think we might be able to solve some of those shortages going forward.
Thank you, Andre. I'm going to finish with you, Megan, because tell me if I've got this wrong. You were at international school overseas, but you're now at an international school in the UK. Have I got that right? Is that where you work?
Is that me you're talking? Yes. So
yeah.
Yes.
So, it's quite unique, isn't it? Working at an international school but being based in the UK.
Right. So I did go international, and then after 10 years in the Middle East, in Oman, in Muscat, I came back to the UK as a head of section here. So I left there as a middle school principal. I came into another international school in the UK, and currently is 2 years now in my role, enjoying it. It's an American boarding school in the leafy areas of Surrey. So it's really, really quite nice to be experiencing the international experience while living in the UK, because that's the kind of the difference. Because when I came back, I was struggling with, am I going to go back into the system? Am I, while widely experienced, as Andre is pointing out, and you do come back really well experiencing, just having a kind of well-being feeling and more motivated to do certain things. I was worried that coming into the system, and it didn't matter to me where in the system I came into, whether I'd be ready. But as it was, I was maybe qualified enough to apply for a job in an international school year, and was well I'm supported for that. But one of the points that you mentioned, sorry, just to go into the whole idea of the way how in terms of people of color and so on, one of the things that I want to always, a message I'd like to share is that, and it's that, I am a Jamaican, educated at a university in Jamaica, but no one knows the name of it, who came to the UK and came into the UK system, went internationally, got educated, did the work, got into positions in the international scene, returned, and is now an international school principal, right? And the point is, in every one of those settings, I made a decision to apply for roles and put myself forward and put myself head to head. In this current school, when I looked at the senior leadership team, when I was applying for the job, there was not a person of color on that team. It's very easy to look at that and go, I'll never get this job. It's very easy to look at that and say, there's no space in this team for me. And will I have a voice? Will I have a place? Will I have space? I made a decision that I want to always feel like an imposter. So I want to come back to Yamina's point about an imposter. I am never, ever comfortable not feeling like an imposter. That is my motivational piece to anyone, that the imposter syndrome is the feeling you want if you want to be successful. The moment you are in a position where you're like, I'm okay, then you need to start moving again. You need to get used to feeling comfortable in the outside of your comfort zone. And so I have stepped many, many times into those spaces simply because I have decided in many cases I love being an imposter or feeling that feeling, because it told me that I challenged myself. So I'm only saying that because one of the things that you mentioned around those spaces, these spaces are white spaces because the history of these spaces were rooted in the colonization history. It is for people like us to step out and say, other people can step into those spaces, and for people to make those decisions. So what we have to do is stop self-selecting. I'm saying that for me and for people who are out there like me. All of the spaces, even in the UK, if we fight and push and fight enough, we'll have enough people out there who will be listening. So,
I love that. And I also want to add as well, Megan, about the fact that when you came back, you reached out to me to say, like, I'm back and I need to network. Where do I need to go? Who do I need to be networking with? So going back to Yumina's comment about building connection, building community, belonging, we have to be quite proactive in how we do that.
And I just wanted to say, like, even a book like this, who am I to be gathering 24 authors across the world and say, let's get together and do something about international school research? Who am I? It's simply just a random person who said, let's do it. So I'm just putting that out to say anyone can. And there's no magic in any of all of this. It's simply a will to contribute. So that's my message.
Perfect. That's a great way to end. Thank you, all three of you. Great to see you, Andre, Megal, and Yamina. Thank you for the work you've done. The barriers you've navigated to actually get the book to the printer. I can't wait to see the hard copy. And thanks for being here and for sharing the work you're doing. I'm going to put all the links out in the follow-up email with the recording so people can go onto Amazon or their preferred book publisher and buy their books as well. So please go and enjoy your evenings, have your dinner. We're going to welcome our last panel onto the live stream. But thank you all for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Hannah.
Thank you.
See you later. Thank you. Bye. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight for our Diverse Ed World Book Day event. Some of you have been with us now for almost 2 hours, so it's almost time for dinner. And we've doubled the numbers in the last 90 minutes, where we've got quite high viewing numbers now. So thank you, everyone who has tuned in. This fourth and final panel, we're going to go from thinking about the school system to school culture, because the authors and the books we're going to be exploring are really about the culture of the educational workplaces in which we are contributing and occupying. So I'm delighted to be joined by Lucy, Nadia and Kit. Kit's counter author Alison can't be here, but I know she's here in spirit. So similar format, we're going to have 5 minutes for each of you to talk about the book you've co-produced, that you've published. We've got the audience listening. I'm going to then field any questions or create the questions myself, and we're then going to wrap up tonight's event. So Kit, I'm going to start with you then. It's lovely to see you. I know we've had a few emails over the last few months. It's nice to have a face for the email address. Welcome, and tell us all about the book that you read. But you need to unmute so we can hear you first.
Yeah, you've got me, and actually Alison's the classy one, so you've got me instead. So our book is Curious Not Furious, and it's about being curious, not furious. Really, it came about for several reasons. Actually, lots of people who we'd been working with and providing training in the staff, for staff, school staff, but we work in lots of different areas. So we work in social care and health, and with the police. So we work across anyone who works with or cares for children, actually. And we know that there's loads of staff who understand about neurodifference and want neuro-inclusive schools. And they're desperate for that, but they're not quite sure how to actually make that happen. And in lots of the training we had done, because we work with parents and carers and foster carers and schools and police, and lots of people have said, you need to write a book about your approach, something which is really simple. So we kind of, the kind of book we wanted to write was a book that a really shattered teacher or parent might be able to pick up at the end of a long day and read a few pages. And it was a difficult one because there was part of me thinking it needs to have really good references throughout. And I do a little bit of work for the University of Sussex. So there was part of me thinking, oh, they're all going to say, what? There's no referencing to that. But in the end, we decided that formality is quite a barrier. And all of our work is about making it really accessible. And our work is about how we can be neuro-inclusive and a whole school approach, but not just something different for those children who struggle. And I think it creates a different culture. If you're talking about staff room culture, it's the same approach with staff as it is with young people. It's the same approach with colleagues. It's about saying, I wonder why they're finding that a bit difficult. Or I wonder why I wonder why that member of staff finds it so much easier to implement that new thing than that member of staff. I wonder what that's all about. So understanding it comes from neuroscience. So it's about neuroscience and psychology and coaching all wrapped up in one, and has got this big evidence base that I suppose we kind of simplify and say, let's not make it where you then have to translate. If you're working with a young person or with an adult, actually, let's not have theory that person's then got to go, well, that's a theory. How do I do that? And I think that was probably, I come from a background of headship as well. And I think when I look at the CPD I had back in, and I was in schools for 25, I think it was 91 or 92. I must look it up sometime. I did a PGCE, in those days where then you spent the next few years actually learning how to teach. And it felt as if the CPD was about the theory, but not necessarily. And this is what it means to whole school processes and whole school culture. And so really enabling leaders and teachers to say, this is how you would actually do it. So it's very practical. It's called a practical toolkit because it's very practical. And it's we have a lot of visuals and a lot of props, because we believe, like this one, we believe it's it's the hook for people, isn't it? When we start with lots of props, people start saying, it gives them a hook for it. And it enables also those people who are non-verbal to manage too. So that's our book. And we actually did it in an unusual way. In fact, I'd heard about Barbara Cartland never wrote a single word herself either typing or writing. And Alison had really wanted to write a book, and we'd been nagged about it for some time. And I kept thinking, oh, that seems like a really big thing to do. I kind of had it in my head, but it was actually getting, I don't know why, because I did a master's and I managed to write thousands of words for that. So, but there was some kind of blockage. So we decided over lockdown, we would meet each week on Zoom. I lay on a couch and I went blah, 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 blah. And Alison, who's really clever at these sorts of things, she tapped. And then we did it as a back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So she took lots of stuff that we'd written about our approach, and then we did it in that way. So it was, it felt, for me, quite pain-free, but Alison might say something very different.
It felt like therapy. That's what I'm hearing, Kit. I love this image of you lying on the couch whilst Alison types it all up. But as a process, we're definitely giving ideas tonight about different ways to birth a book. So thank you so much for joining us, Kit. I'm going to swing over to Lucy, and we'll come back to you in the Q&A. Lucy, I think you're down the road from me. You're in Bristol.
Yes, close to Bristol. So I work at Bristol University and I live in Somerset. So yes, I think we are quite close.
I'm in Bath, so I think I could probably hear you if I open my window. But it's fab to finally meet you. So over to you, Lucy, to tell us all about your book.
Okay, so my book is called Reimagining the Diary, Reflective Practice as a Positive Tool for Educator Wellbeing. It's nearly its 1 year anniversary. It was published by John Katz on the 10th of March, which I can't quite believe. And the book basically came from the idea that diary keeping is talked a lot about in other books and the benefits around diary keeping or journaling, but there wasn't a whole book dedicated to it. And I felt that that needed to change. So I lead a research project that's all about opening up the diary and using it as a creative and multimodal space that's fun and moves beyond writing. So I wanted to sort of capture that research in a book and share some of those ideas with others so that they too could reap the benefits around diary keeping and use it so that they could flourish inside and outside the classroom, essentially. I think we talk a lot about well-being, but sometimes it's hard to know what well-being actually means to us personally. It's that term that's used a lot. And, you know, there's the saying that one person's well-being dream is another person's well-being nightmare. And I truly believe that a diary or journal can help you to find out what well-being means to you, to tailor it, to personalize it, and to capture what you can do then to fill up your well-being cup, however big or small that might be. So the book offers some of the key benefits around diary keeping and journaling, which come from, you know, my 5-year research project, namely catharsis, so that act of downloading. So Kit was talking about lying on the couch and that therapy. So a diary is definitely that. But also celebration. And that's something that we as educators probably don't think about. We aren't very good at celebrating ourselves and all of our achievements. And a diary is a great way to do that and to build up that evidence bank around what you're doing and how well you're doing in any aspect of your life. And it's also a space to gain perspective on different events and situations, which can be really helpful in terms of letting go of something and moving on and thinking about your why and your internal compass. So I share lots about those key benefits, drawing on findings from the project, but I also talk about how to overcome some of the barriers around diary keeping and journaling, namely time and motivation. And so I draw on a lot of work around habit formation, you know, things like James Clear's Atomic Habits, which is great. And we talk about how to put your diary into your calendar, to make it a top priority, to make it visible. But essentially what this book is about is, in order to help you to make it a habit, it's about opening up the diary beyond writing. So my work is very much showing people that a diary can be anything you want it to be. We can let go of the shoulds around diary keeping, and we can bring in things other than writing, such as drawing and audio recordings and scrapbooking and tracking the weather, etc., using emojis, anything you want. If it's a scrapbook of your life, have fun with it. So I suppose my book is giving people permission to do that and to give them lots of practical ideas on how to approach it. And in terms of my publishing journey, I was very lucky and it happened very quickly. So I was in contact with Kat Howard and Jamie Tom, and they were working with John Katz and said that they might be interested in it. So they put me in touch. I shared an idea for the book and they said yes. And then it happened really quickly. And I'm very pleased that John Katz published it, because I am an academic, I work in a university, but I wanted this to be something really accessible and practical. And there's lots of reflective activities for people to actually sort of scribble inside the book and for it to be usable. And very much, I don't want it to be pristine by the end of a reading. I want it to be dog-eared and have lots of things in it.
Fabulous, Lucy. Thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. I'm going to swing over to Nadia to hear about Nadia's book, and then we'll open it out. And Nadia and I are doing tonight together virtually, and I get to meet you in person again on Saturday.
I'm looking forward to it.
Twice in 1 week.
I'm very excited about Saturday. And thank you for inviting me, Hannah. My book is called The Unhappy Head Teacher. I wrote this book in response to working with lots and lots of head teachers. I'm a former head teacher myself. I now am a coach, and I started to see patterns in what was going wrong in headship for many head teachers. And in a way, I feel like this is the head teacher version of Yamina's book. And many of the themes that she touched on, I do too. So, you know, why are so many head teachers leaving the profession? I've identified 2 key reasons. One of them is boredom and one of them is burnout. And so the book aims to address those 2 things really by looking at what well-being means to you, but also learning how to find your voice as a way of staying engaged in the role. And you know, it's very much written from the heart of drawing on my own experience and that of my clients, but wanting to make sure that head teachers don't feel alone, and that's what I'm aiming to do. There is a mixture of practical tools and knowledge building, I would say, and it's got a nice little summary at the end of each chapter for people who haven't got time to read a book, like head teachers that don't. Like, I certainly didn't when I was a head teacher. I have time for books, but I do now. So in terms of how it was born, is a bit of an odd story, really. My mum sadly was terminally ill, and I spent a lot of time with her for about a year in the last year of her life. And my mum has an extraordinary story. And so I worked with her and a publisher to write her life story in the time that she was ill. And during this time, the 2 of them started nagging me and telling me, you've got to write your book. This is, you know, like your. And so we, in these sessions where my mum would be recorded and the editor would write and I would chip in about her life. And my mum used to be editor of the Women's Voice in the 60s and had all these incredible stories. And they were fun sessions, and it was remarkably inspiring experience. But I started to put sort of like true primary school teacher style, like A2 sheets up on my mum's bedroom wall and plan out my book and sort of cheekily just ask for their input. And so we kind of, in addition to my mum's work, we came up with a blueprint for this. And so it felt very much a way of honouring that time as well. And my mum was saying to me at the time, you've got to write a book because that's how you reach more heads, and you've got to let them know that their voice matters. And I think that's my message, is that we are put on in every direction in headship. And that if we functioned in a system that listened more to head teachers, I think that the school system would be less broken. And that's what I hope people will take from reading the book.
That's a beautiful story, Nadia. I love the duality of your mum's legacy being published, but you like birthing your own book at the same time. It's also it was that family legacy. It's beautiful, and I'm assuming that your book came out once your mum had passed, but your mum was part of the process as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it wasn't long after she died, actually, that it came. Well, it was a few months after she died, so it all seemed a bit strange. And her book is still in manuscript because I can't bring myself to read it.
Oh, I can imagine.
I owe it to her. Now I've said this out loud, I probably owe it to her. I've got 2 or 3 publishers that are quite interested in my mum's book, so I do need to do something with it. But yeah, she'd have been so delighted that I did it. She probably would have told me it was a load of rubbish, but she would have found things wrong with my English, I'm sure. But yeah, it was a fabulous experience, Hannah.
Well, if you want some accountability, maybe you come back next year with your mum's book.
That's such a great idea. I've got
or International Women's Day event next year.
Yeah,
you share your mum's book. There you go. We can shake hands on that.
Yeah.
Beautiful. So let me come back with some questions then. Kit, I loved what you were saying about like formality being a barrier sometimes to us finding your voice. And we talked about the imposter syndrome on the last panel. We often perhaps like create artificial barriers about how a book should be written, presented, and this idea of it being quite formal, quite academic. Can you just talk a little bit more about how you consciously like stepped away from that or consciously disrupted this idea of formality? But you need to unmute so we can hear you.
Sorry, I'm not good at this.
Got you.
I think that the issue around formality is something that's sort of followed me through my professional career, actually. That kind of, I don't know if it's to do with my child. I'm a vicar's daughter, and there was a lot of formality when I was a child, you know, and the bishop came around and we had to sit very up. And early in my career, there was a very big focus on formality. And I think sometimes it was to the detriment of professionalism. And I think sometimes there was a kind of cloak of what people called professionalism. It was actually formality. You know, sometimes I'll give an example of that. Early on in my career, there was someone in the next door classroom to me, and she screamed at me. And actually, a lot of her practice. And first of all, she must have felt really unhappy. And I look back and I think, wow, I wish she'd been supported better by school leaders at the time. But I think there was this, we shouldn't at that point, and we're going back, you know, I'm in my 50s, so we're going back a while. But there was a kind of, we have to be formal because that's what school's all about. And I think there was definitely an air of, you know, peer group feel if we write something which is really accessible enough for parents and carers and a whole range of different professionals working with children. But then I was overridden by the fact that I really believe that there's so many different approaches and books about how we can support young people who are struggling, and we don't need to make children feel bad in order to help them to do better. And when we look at the number of exclusions and suspensions and detentions, the amount of time and effort spent on what people call behaviour in school, and actually having another book, I believe we needed something that was really practical and something which was a whole school approach, because I think there's plenty out there which are kind of interventions for young people, but for me it's much more about a language which is a language for everybody, and a language. It was interesting. I think it kind of replicates some of the things that you both have said, Lucy and Nadia, about, you know, I'm a real believer in having structures and a shared language across the community. And our book was very much, our approach was very much originally designed to be the glue which kind of brought different professionals together, and parents and carers and school. And I'd sat around many tables in the days where you'd have a TAF or TAC meeting where there would be someone from CAMS. I know everyone's like, really? But there was enough capacity then. There'll be the paediatrician, there's someone, a clinical psychologist, someone from CAMS, all different professions. But actually we all had different languages. We all had different, I think that's still a problem. We've got these different paperwork, different forms. And so the book was partly about that, about something which was accessible for all and wasn't a barrier for some, you know, some members of that group, you know, so youth workers and early help workers and parents and carers and foster carers. So yeah, it was very much about that, and making sure that people, there wasn't anyone. It's a bit like you look at governors and you think, well, who are the governors of schools? Do they really represent our young people in schools? Often not, because actually there's a big barrier for lots of people because of the way governing body meetings are held. Where, you know, so there's so many people in our community, they're like, well, I don't know, sit around that table and what does it mean, AOB, and what all these papers and the agenda. So I'm a real believer in making and the processes of education accessible for everybody.
Yeah, thank you for that, Kit. And you've picked up the word I wanted to come back to you on, Lucy, this idea of finding and removing barriers to make things more accessible. That's what I've heard you've done there, that we have quite a formal understanding of what a diary is, and you've kind of like exploded it, you've disrupted it. Just tell us a little bit more about that conscious process.
I like the idea of being disruptive. I'm not normally called a disruptive person, but I'll take that, Hannah, so thank you. So yeah, I think that a bit like wellbeing and some of what Kit was sharing, diary is a really heavily loaded term. It has a lot of cultural, historical, literary baggage. We've studied diaries at school. We have a template for a diary. And that can be quite restrictive because it brings a lot of shoulds around diary keeping. It should be a dated entry. It should start Dear Diary. It should be written in paragraphs, etc. And that can really limit what you get out of the diary. And I really believe that a diary is such a powerful tool, and it doesn't have to be expensive. You don't need lots of equipment. It can be for anybody. But if we want to help people get the most from their diary keeping practice, then we need to let go of those shoulds around diary keeping and expand it beyond writing. That's not to say there isn't a place for writing. There definitely is, but it can be bullet points, and it can be, you know, a Twitter post or an Instagram post or whatever, but it can also include visual and audio entries as well. And I think the more creative we are with our diaries and the more types of entries we use within them, the more we get to know ourselves and our wellbeing needs. And in the book, I draw on the work of Gunther Kress, who is a social semiotician, and he talks about multimodality and this idea that we communicate through different mediums and different approaches. And to use one medium, such as writing, means you'll only get so far in your communication with yourself and your, you know, and others, your inner and outer world. So therefore, if we want to deepen that communication and strengthen it, then we need to use lots of different approaches. And my book is very much about that. And if you don't like writing, that's fine. Your diary doesn't need to contain it. Make it work for you, because the more of you bring to your diary and those interests and hobbies that you have, the more likely you are to keep the habit going and to get the most from it.
Yeah, I love that, Lucy. And that links back to not what Nadia said about helping people find their voice and head teachers' voice as being important, but most head teachers being too busy to read or to write. I'm curious, Nadia, about how your books landed and resonated with your target audience, and like what kind of feedback have you had about them?
I mean, overwhelmingly positive. I keep waiting for somebody to tell me I don't know what I'm talking about. And I think that's because I based it on, 4 years of working with, hundreds of head teachers. And so, and the same things keep coming up, and the same, I keep doing the same work. So far, I've had a phenomenal response to it, and lots of dialogue around, about what is the future of schools and where do head teachers feature in that. Going back to your previous panel, there's also something about putting head teachers being brave enough to put themselves forward, and kind of increasing their influence. I think that I hope that I think that there is evidence that it's empowering people. They read it and they feel like they see themselves in it, and they see that all is not lost.
Yeah, I love that. Have you encouraged any of them to like put pen to paper and find their voice? Has it led to other writing projects out of interest?
So actually it has. And what started to happen as a result of this is I've opened up a blog space for head teachers on my website. And teachers who do head teachers who do programs with me, but just people who wrote the book. It was kind of a challenge in the book is to write and to codify what you do. If you've got something that's working for autistic children in your school, tell people about it. If you've got something that's working for families, tell people about it, because that's how you increase your influence. There's a whole chapter called broadening your horizon by broadening that of others, or, it's along those lines. And it's a growing blog space. People keep rewrite the book and often submit a blog to me. And I'm hoping it's like a sea of great things that schools are doing, but they're kind of, as blogs are, they're a short snapshot of things to be proud of and things to show off about in headship.
Yeah, absolutely. When I was a head, I blogged once a month, and I used to host other people's blogs, because I think sometimes people worry about writing and people reading it, but like it feels quite heavy to like buy your own blog domain or to have like your own space. Doesn't it? Like I remember the first time I did that, I felt like, oh god, this feels a bit. So actually holding a space for other voices to be amplified.
Absolutely.
You feel like you're part of something else, maybe.
Yeah, and I have had a couple of people have actually written to me saying, I don't want this published, but I wanted to share it with you. And that's, I'm holding that space without sharing it. I mean, it's wonderful. I wish they would. I wish everybody would, because I think, building voice is imperative if we're going to stabilize this broken system we're functioning within.
Absolutely. And your title, Kit and Alison, Curious Not Furious. My mantra is curious not critical. So in the work I do with schools, as soon as you get critical, people shut down. I want to talk about inclusion. So trying to help people to lead with curiosity rather than criticality is one of my mantras. Where did your title come from, Curious Not Furious? You need to unmute.
I'm a mantra person. I don't think I recognise that until, but although actually ex-colleagues say, oh, you had that mantra and that mantra. So I think I do like a mantra. And Curious Not Furious was a very early one. A later one, I think people always think of when you're using coaching and you're being curious rather than critical or furious, they think it might be permissive. And so another mantra that I use regularly in schools is insistent, persistent, consistent with a bucket full of kindness. That actually you can be insistent and you can be persistent. You should be consistent. That's really important. But you can have a bucket full of kindness when you hold, because no one rises to low expectations, whether it's of staff or students or young people and children. So it's about holding that as a kind of in your head all the time. And one of our other mantras is good for me, good for you, good for everyone. So, coming away from this kind of rules-based, boundaries-based, and actually saying it's just about helping young people to learn how to be a great member of, whether it's a partner or a neighbour or a employee, employer, friend, that they're always thinking in terms of good for me, good for you, good for everyone. I think we could do that.
You need a T-shirt series, Kit. I feel like there's some T-shirts,
a
bit of merch.
The brain test is another one. I talk about, that's me dropping props. The need you have to be at your brain best. So that's another one. Yeah, I should get a whole series of T-shirts.
Seriously, I think you need T-shirts. I'm going to wrap it up there. Just say a massive thank you for the three of you waiting for the whole event to be at the last panel. But thank you for your contributions, your reflections, but also what you've created. Yeah, hold them up. Hold up your books so people can recognise those front covers. Thank you very much. I'm going to send out all the links with the recording. But thank you for joining me tonight, and thank you for the work you do.
Thank you for having
Nadia, I'll see you in Cambridge on Saturday.
Can't wait.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone. Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Bye.